morning, Madeline. Good morning, principals.
It is an honor to have you with us this morning. Well, I just want to say a little bit about Senator Sanders before he starts, but I'm going to be very brief. Senator Sanders has always been a very strong advocate for us here in Vermont as educators. It was about 5 or 6 years ago when I was new going to Washington that Senator Sanders emphatically said to us as a group when we were attending the National Leaders Conference, the educational community has got to start standing up and voicing their beliefs and their opinions as to what's happening in their schools and what's happening with students and education. And I think the message here over the last 3 days with Dr. Tarazi and everyone else that you've heard from, Tony Wagner, that's exactly what we have to do. We have to be advocates, and we have to be strong and tell what we need in our schools and what's happening. And if there was ever a time in education to make a stand and start to do that, it is now. Senator Sanders is on the committee of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. This is a very powerful committee in Washington. We have very strong and powerful people in great places that can support us, and he has positioned himself well. His strong loyalty to Vermont, his acute sensibility, and his courage to speak with what he strongly believes in is a great asset. And so it is with great pleasure this morning that I introduce to you, straight from Washington, Senator Bernard Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madeline, for those very, very kind words. And I want to begin by thanking all of you for what you do every single day. It is clear to me, and I think study after study makes the point, that no school in America can be successful without a strong and attentive principal. And as the records very clearly indicate, Vermont has a lot of successful schools, so you guys must be doing something right, and I thank you very much for that. I also want to thank the Vermont Principal Association. I want to thank Madeline again, and I want to thank Ken Page for all of the great work that you are doing. I understand that these are hard times for schools and for principals, that you have to make some very difficult decisions. So let me begin by relaying to you what I believe is some very good news. I know these are hard times. We don't often get good news, but I think we've got some for you this morning. And that is that in the midst of this very serious recession, while we want to make sure that our kids get the best education possible, I'm very happy to tell you that yesterday in the Senate, we overcame a Republican filibuster and passed legislation that will provide some $19.3 million to Vermont and save some 300 teaching positions in our state. We needed 60 votes, and we got 61 votes. And I think, as you know, this vote yesterday came just as Vermont school officials were notifying 283 school districts across the state of spending cuts totaling more than $23 million. So I know people are going to have to do a lot of juggling, but I think it was very, very important they were able to pass that legislation. And it was good, obviously, not only for Vermont. Nationally, as I understand it, we will be saving about 140,000 teaching jobs. Further, I don't have to tell any of you, because you do this battle every March, with property taxes in Vermont much too high, and when at a time we have a hard-pressed state government, this legislation will also provide desperately needed help for Vermont and states, cities, and towns all across the country. And this legislation, which was passed yesterday, we got 61 votes, It's going to come back to the Senate today. The House is going to have to, the House was on recess. They're going to have to come back to Washington to vote for this. The President has said that he is going to sign this bill with enthusiasm. So I think all of this is going to happen. And I think at the nick of time, it is some pretty good news. Now, as Madeline indicated, I think, and as many of you know, I sit on the Senate Education Committee. And let me touch on the major legislative work that is ongoing. It's been going on for a while on that committee. The No Child Left Behind Act of President Bush, which I'm happy to tell you is once again being called ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, is, as you know, up for reauthorization. But unfortunately, and I want to be quite balanced here, unfortunately, while the name Nickleby is now dead, some of the unfortunate ideas in that educational approach remain alive. The legislation, which, as you all are aware, was incredibly test-dependent and which sought to punish schools rather than to encourage them, is being modified but not discarded. And that is not good enough for me. We want to go further. A major part of my effort in the Education Committee is to make sure that when we revise the law, and it's not clear when that's coming up, but I suspect it will be within a couple of months, what I want to see is that the most punitive aspects of that legislation are removed. Under President Bush, the law set out to punish schools that did not make what is called adequate yearly progress. And there are some in Congress who still favor that approach. But the Obama administration and Secretary of Education Duncan are much more realistic about expectations and want to measure student growth rather than measuring whether schools meet some arbitrary standards in reading and mathematics. And that's the good news. But here's the news that's not so good. We all want to hold schools accountable and teachers accountable. But it is simply unfair, as in my view Secretary Duncan is attempting to do, to punish teachers based on very narrow criteria. If students do well on mass-produced, standardized multiple-choice tests, teachers are to get so-called merit increases. If students do not do well, regardless of the circumstances, teachers could be fired. Is this better than closing down schools that underperform? I don't think so. The punishments that earlier were meted out on schools will now be meted out on teachers. That is not acceptable to me. Now, of course, you who are here today know that the administration is still insisting that principals be removed, schools be reconstituted, just as was threatened under President Bush. In fact, 5 Vermont schools fell into this category this year, including H.O. Wheeler in Burlington, where Principal Joyce Irvine was removed, even though she was totally remaking the school into a magnet school and arts academy. Now, a lot of what ESEA does to your schools lies in its details, the small print. So let me very briefly touch on some of the details that we are working hard on. ESEA, especially under the current administration, is very oriented toward the needs of urban schools. I think it's important that we bring the needs of rural schools into the discussion, and a significant part of what my staff does is to work to make sure that the needs of rural schools and rural students are dealt with equitably. Almost all of the measurement of schools, which, as I said, is often punitive, depends on standards, assessments, and accountability. Here are several principles that I am committed to as we deal with the important inner workings of ESEA. And by the way, on all of these issues, we look forward to working with you to make sure that we work the details out right. But let me just go over some of the issues that we're going to be focusing on. I want to see the basic mode of assessment based on individual student growth from year to year. I want to see assessments make use of multiple indicators and multiple assessments. Depending entirely or even largely on high-stakes testing is not an accurate way of measuring either student accomplishment or school adequacy. Multiple indicators allow us to use important measures such as graduation rates. And by the way, we should all be proud that Vermont has the highest graduation rate in the country. And we also want to look at student attendance as measures of whether schools are succeeding. Multiple assessments allow us to use a variety of methods to assess students. Vermont students, for instance, score in the top 3 or 4 on the kneecap tests in both 4th and 8th grade, in both verbal and mathematical skills. I want to see a broad curriculum and assessments and standards in other areas. Math and verbal literacy are enormously important, but they are not the only areas that we should be focusing on. We need to make sure that our kids are familiar and understand history, science, civics, and the arts, among many other important aspects of what kids should be learning. Further, I very strongly believe that schools must be accountable, no debate about that, but they should be accountable for achieving realistic goals which take account of school student demographics and of the level of current actual achievement. Schools which are largely low income and may have a whole lot of immigrant kids coming into them cannot be judged in the same way that an upper middle class school is. That is wrong and that is unrealistic. And what we have got to make sure is that standards are developed not because they make good talking points in a political debate and too often have no correlation to the real challenges facing a school. In fact, in my view, they often are self-defeating, because if you're going to tell principals that they are quote-unquote failing, if you're going to tell teachers who are working under impossible circumstances that they are about to fail, what kind of principal, what kind of teacher is going to jump into that very difficult challenge if they're going to be told a few years later that they are failing? That does not make sense to me. Let me conclude by very briefly touching on a couple of other issues that I'm working on that I know that many of you are working on as well. And that is extended education and early childhood education. I am firmly committed to extended education, using our schools to provide expanded learning time for our kids. Our schools in many ways still run today on a 19th century agrarian calendar. They open in early September and they close in mid-June. And what we all know from study after study, that Title I students, those who get free or reduced lunches, in general, lose about 30% of their learning gains from the previous year over the summer. They very often go home to schools, go home to their families, where there are just not a lot of intellectual stimulation in many cases. Out of school, distant from a learning environment, they lose the schools that they lose the skills that they learned and the capacities they developed over the summer months. Now, I'm very happy to tell you that we are beginning to bring funds into Vermont to expand summer programs. This year we've worked with schools in Burlington, in Bennington, and Rutland. And I hope that in the future we'll be able to work with a lot more schools. And what these summer programs are doing, and I just visited the one in Burlington, is they're providing academics to the kids in the morning, they're providing recreational and cultural enrichment in the afternoon. Kids are going swimming, they're playing ball, they're going out to sing what the state of Vermont is about. And these kids are happy. They're excited to be in school. Their parents are excited to have them in school. It is a concept that is working. And I hope very much that in the next couple of years, we're going to be able to pass legislation that makes that concept available to every school in America that needs it. Furthermore, as all of you know, we have excellent after-school programs in the state of Vermont that do exactly the same thing. Instead of having kids, I go around the state a lot and I talk to a lot of kids. And you go to a small town and I say to the kids, you know, what's on your mind? And they say, well, after school is boring. There's nothing to do. Nothing to do. And that's the time of day, as you all know, where kids get into trouble. It seems to me to make sense that we provide strong after-school programs where kids can get tutoring, kids can learn, kids can have a good time. They can be involved in constructive activities. It's good for the kids, and it's good for working parents who don't get home perhaps until 5 o'clock. So that's an area that we want to continue working on. Lastly, I want to say a word about early childhood education. All of us who are concerned about the kids should not be proud that the United States today has the highest rate of childhood poverty of any industrialized country on earth. And we're talking about 22% of our kids who are living in poverty. And this carries over to many lower income, working class families in Vermont and around this country who are desperately searching for decent quality, affordable child care. And very often, that child care is not there. And what we're seeing is kids from 3 months on who are sitting in front of television sets with untrained child care workers year after year after year. They get into kindergarten, they get into the first grade, they're already a year or 2 years behind, they get discouraged, and 10 years later they're dropping out of school. So when we talk about education, we also have to make sure that every kid in this country, regardless of his or her income, gets the quality child care that they deserve. And I think when we do that, kids are going to enter school a lot better prepared than they are in many instances today. So let me conclude by thanking you very much for what you are doing, for thanking your teachers for what they are doing. I know every single day that schools get a bum rap, that somehow, despite all the problems in society, it is only the schools, only the public schools that are responsible for curing them. But I have been around the state enough to know that we have some of the very best schools in the United States of America, some of the most caring faculty in the United States of America, and those things don't happen unless we have excellent, hard-working principals. So once again, thank you all for the very hard and stressful work that you are doing. I look forward to working with you in the years to come. Thank you all very much.